This is a SandyBoy Productions podcast.
Welcome to the Herban Farmacy Podcast, where we help women remove the overwhelm of living their most holistic life. This is the place to find evidence-based nutrition tactics, healthy lifestyle and wellness tips, abundance mindset, and easily implementable low-tox living strategies so you can rise up to your full potential and protect your family's health. I'm your host, Stacey Hein, certified holistic nutritionist and better living advocate. Now, let's get empowered with some simple swaps that make a big impact for optimal wellness. Woohoo! Welcome to episode 1 of the Herban Farmacy Podcast. This is such an exciting episode because we have an amazing guest and my friend Lauren McNeill, who is a registered dietitian that specializes in plant-based nutrition. She has a master's of public health in nutrition and dietetics with a collaborative specialization in women's health and runs the private practice and social media pages Tasting to Thrive, where she shares plant-based nutrition, recipe, and wellness information, and is such a joy to talk to. She has a virtual private practice where she helps those who are vegetarian, vegan, plant-based, or just wanting to incorporate more plant-based foods into their everyday eating pattern. She also runs an online program called Thriving on Plant-Based Fundamentals, where she teaches everything you need to know to thrive on a plant-based diet. Today's episode is about plant-based athletes, plant-based kids, overall plant-based general wellness, and a little bit about entrepreneurship. So I cannot wait for you to hear all of the golden nuggets that Lauren has to share with us. Here we go, episode 1. Okay, welcome, Lauren McNeill. I am so excited to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm doing well. Can't complain. It's nice and sunny out. That's always a good way to start the day. So I'm happy.
Fantastic. Awesome. Okay, so let's just dive right in. Before I get into our nutrition questions, I have to ask you, my friend, where did you get your food inspo? Because your Instagram feed looks insane. Have you always loved to cook, or where did that come from?
Oh, well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. You know what? I actually haven't always liked to cook. It wasn't until I actually transitioned to a vegetarian and then vegan diet that I really embraced cooking. And it was kind of out of necessity. There weren't that many restaurants that had vegetarian options, and the people around me weren't really cooking vegetarian or plant-based foods. So I sort of got into cooking myself. I think the first cookbook that I ever bought was the Oshi Glow's cookbook. And she's like the OG vegan blogger. She's amazing. And so I guess if I were to say that I drew inspiration from anyone, it would probably be her. Her recipes are amazing. And in terms of food photography, which is kind of a whole different kind of game to recipe development, I just draw inspiration from everywhere. I really like the more natural elements, so I tend to go with like darker colors and things like that. But I always feel like I'm kind of just learning along the way. I appreciate you saying that because I'm sure you kind of feel the same way. Sometimes you look at your own feed, your own photos, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is not good. So I feel like I'm always kind of growing and drawing inspiration and things like that. But I appreciate you saying that.
Heck yeah. And speaking of growing,
what helped you decide that you wanted to have your own practice in dietetics versus working in a clinical setting? I am an entrepreneur myself, and I really love to ask my guests these questions because most of the guests are entrepreneurs in one way. And, working for yourself is not always the easiest, but I would love to know that journey for you.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's definitely not the easiest. There's definitely ups and downs. I feel like the main reason that I wanted to work for myself was because I just wasn't happy in any other roles that I found myself in. I did a very traditional dietetic internship. To become a dietitian, you have to do a 1-year clinical dietetic internship where you work in several different areas of the hospital and community settings, public health. And while I definitely learned an incredible amount from that opportunity, it didn't really sit well with me. And it didn't allow me to really focus on what I wanted to do, which is talk about food and eating and recipes and transitioning to plant-based diets and thriving on plant-based diets. So that's really why I decided to start a private practice, because I really just wanted that opportunity to follow my passion and then to help other people with their passion, if that's plant-based eating and recipes and wellness as well.
Heck yeah. It's so important to step into that place of happiness and, try our very best to drop what might look traditional or safe. Yeah. And step into that place that, is going to bring us ultimate happiness. And I love that you listen to your intuition and your heart and your gut to do that, because you do what you do very well.
Thank you.
So, all right, next question. Why did you decide to focus your work on plant-based nutrition specifically?
Such a good question. I mean, honestly, it kind of started out selfishly. I was vegetarian, plant-based before, kind of when I started becoming a registered dietitian. And I felt like there weren't that many really good resources to help me along my journey. It took me a long time to really find my own way with eating and what worked well for my body. And as I transitioned to being a registered dietitian, I realized that there were so many people who wanted to follow plant-based diets as well, who just didn't have the resources and didn't have that knowledge of how to do it in a really safe way that was really maintainable. So when I decided that I wanted to start my own practice, it just felt natural that that would be the focus of the practice, is plant-based nutrition. So I do help people who aren't fully vegetarian or vegan, but I always say that my clients are, at least usually wanting to incorporate more plant-based foods into their everyday eating pattern. That's why they choose to work with me most of the time. But I really just wanted to fill that gap and have myself, as someone who is a nutrition expert, be sharing, evidence-based information that was really attainable to people.
Yes, I love that so much. And, they say a lot of the times that we oftentimes teach what we need to know the most or what we've already been through. And so I don't think it's selfish. I think that you have mastered your craft, which is awesome. Okay,
you.
So let's get in a little bit to the nutrition side of things now. I get a lot of questions from parents. So how would you help parents help their kids who are not currently eating a vegetarian or vegan diet to transition to this way of living?
Such a good question. It can be really, really tricky. And I think when we're working with parents, I work with a lot of parents, a lot of new parents, and it always feels like it's one thing to make this decision for yourself or for themselves to follow a vegetarian or a vegan diet. But then when you have kids, you feel like there's this whole new level of responsibility, of course, that every decision that you make, you feel responsible for their health and how they're feeling feeling. So I completely understand the hesitation that a lot of parents feel and just that pressure. I always say just to take things really, really slowly. So don't feel like you need to transition from having an omnivorous diet to having a vegetarian or a vegan diet overnight. It can be a really, really slow transition. And I actually find that that tends to work best, especially when we're talking about kids, if they weren't, vegan or vegetarian from birth, because that allows their palates to change, the types of food that they're craving to change, the types of food that they're incorporating to change, and them to kind of get used to that. Sometimes feeding kids regardless can be challenging. So when we're trying to, follow a vegetarian or vegan diet, that can be even harder. Just some practical tips. I'm a huge fan of mixing in vegetarian or vegan options with more traditional options. So say you're making tacos, using half lentils and half meat for those tacos, and then slowly increasing the amount of the lentils. I always recommend finding vegetarian or vegan substitutions for your kids' favorite foods so that, you can still accommodate what they're craving and what they want, but with a vegetarian or a vegan option. And then just always kind of showing them this way of eating for yourself. So kids always want to kind of mimic what their parents are doing. They love their parents, they admire their parents. So if they see you eating these types of food, it makes them really want to eat it as well. And then, of course, working with a registered dietitian to make sure that your kids are getting the nutrients that they need, because there are definitely some nutrients that we need to be focusing on a vegan or a vegetarian diet from both food and supplements that are really, really important. So I always recommend working with a dietitian for that.
I love that. I love the idea of mixing like lentils with the ground beef and just little by little, just like when you're incorporating more plant foods in your diet, just little by little, especially when you're transitioning to like beans, you can't just have a can of beans instead of the filet mignon. Your gut is going to be like, what is going on? Yeah. So I love that idea. I think that's great. And yeah, maybe we can touch on the really important nutrients as we talk here. So can you explain why it's so important for kiddos to get a good amount of whole plant foods into their diet on a daily basis and how that impacts their long-term health? And I'm just asking this question based off of the amount of processed foods that children are consuming nowadays. Can you just explain how important these whole plant foods are?
Yeah, such a good question. So relying on whole plant-based foods is so important because they're so nutrient dense. So whether you're having beans or lentils or other legumes, tofu, tempeh, edamame, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, nut and seed butters, they're all so dense with nutrients, especially things like iron and calcium and zinc, and vitamin B, all the different B vitamins, all that good stuff, that the main concern with focusing too heavily on what I would call ultra processed or heavily processed food is that they can tend to crowd out those more nutritious choices. So it's totally okay if you want to be giving your kids, on occasion, these more kind of quote unquote ultra processed foods. But what we want to avoid is them crowding out the really, really nutrient dense foods, because we know that kids at this age, regardless of what age it is, they're developing and they're growing, and we need to make sure that they're getting the proper nutrients to help, whether that's brain development or whether that's bone development, to make sure that they're going to be able to thrive, not just at their age now, but when they are into adulthood as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that. It is so true that, and I do teach people the same thing, like try to crowd out your plate with the whole plant foods. And then if you have room for the processed stuff that you really want or that your kiddos want, then you can use those foods. I love that answer. Okay. So speaking of kiddos, what if your kid is in sports and really active, and is there anything in particular that parents should consider if they begin replacing meat with beans or dairy-based sour cream with cashew cream, for instance, should they be worried about their kids getting the right nutrients?
Such a good question. And what I really like about what you said there is replacement. So I think it's so easy when we start following a vegetarian or a vegan diet to just be removing foods, just taking things away. But what we really, really want to be focusing on is that replacement, just like you said. So what I always recommend doing is, let's say chicken, for example. If you are trying to remove chicken from your diet, knowing the nutrients that your kids would have gotten from that chicken and knowing what to replace that with. So with that example, chicken can be high in protein. So we know that if there's a meal that used to be centered around chicken, what can you replace that with to make sure that you are still getting that good source of protein? So maybe that's tofu, maybe that's tempeh, maybe it's beans or lentils, whatever you and your family really enjoys, but making sure you are replacing rather than taking things away. The other thing is making sure that you are getting that good source of protein for your kids, just because they are really active. And I think there's two kind of sides to the fence here in the plant-based vegetarian vegan movement in terms of protein. Some people can be really, really hyper focused on it, and other people can maybe be not enough of a focus on it. So I always recommend trying to make at least a quarter of your plate a really good protein rich source of food. So again, whether that be tofu, tempeh, edamame, or legumes. And that goes for your kids too, making sure that they are getting that good concentrated source of protein. Another nutrient just to be a little bit aware of is iron. If your kid is, say, in a sport where they're running a lot, we know people who run just because of the nature of the sport, the pounding of the feet might be more prone to low iron. So making sure that you're getting good concentrated sources of plant-based iron. So again, things like beans, lentils, tofu, tempeh, dark leafy greens, and pairing that with a source of vitamin C, because we know that vitamin C helps to enhance that absorption of plant-based iron. So whether that be citrus fruits, strawberries, cantaloupe, kale, broccoli, and red pepper are really high sources of vitamin C. So just making sure that you are pairing those. And then lastly, just being really on top of your kids' energy needs. So of course, if they are being more active, maybe offering some more meals or snacks, whether that be bigger portions or an extra snack in the day, and just really allowing them to rely on their own hunger and fullness cues to make sure that you're keeping on top of that, to make sure that they're getting all the nutrients that they need and to prevent injuries as well.
I love that. So I love how you also brought up how there are kind of two different camps, not just in the plant-based world, I think just in the nutrition world in general, when it comes to protein. And I like that you brought that up, because I am the type of person that says, like, maybe just on an Instagram post, like, look, if you're eating enough food, you're getting enough protein. But I think it's so important that you bring up the fact that for kids or for adults even that don't understand like how to transition to this way of living, that they do need to focus on those concentrated sources versus, you know, like to get the same amount of protein that like a block of tofu or, you know, like cubes of tofu are going to give you, you would need to eat a lot. You would need to eat a lot of like, I'm just going to compare this to watermelon, for instance, just because like watermelon has protein in it, but you would have to eat so much of it, right? And I don't think that people are very, they just don't understand the quantity that you would need to eat if you were to eat other foods, like in order to get the proper amount of protein. So I like that you brought that up. Okay, so can you talk, we're talking about protein already. Can you talk about the 9 essential amino acids, protein, and if we can actually get complete protein from plants?
I love this question. Such a good one. So as you mentioned, there are 9 essential amino acids, which means that we need to eat them because our body doesn't make them in adequate quantities on their own. So there are two kind of terms that can be used to describe protein, and these are complete proteins and incomplete proteins. So complete proteins are the ones that contain all 9 essential amino acids, whereas incomplete proteins are the ones that don't contain all 9 essential amino acids. They might have some of the essential amino acids, but they don't have that full spectrum. So meat and animal foods are complete sources of protein. So it used to be thought that that meant that that was a higher quality source of protein. And it was also previously thought that if someone wanted to follow a vegetarian or a vegan diet, that they would have to pair certain foods together in order to make complete sources of protein. So for example, whole grains and beans, they both have kind of the opposite protein that they're high in. So legumes are high in lysine, but relatively low in methionine, which are both essential amino acids, whereas whole grains are high in methionine, but relatively low in lysine. So we used to think that we would have to pair those at every meal in order to get those complete sources of protein. But we now know that our body is able to store pools of amino acids, which means that if we have a meal that might be high in certain amino acids, but low in others, we can draw on these pools to make up for that and to do all of the functions that amino acids and protein are necessary for the body. So there's no real concern of making complete sources of protein. We know that now. What's important is just making sure that you are getting a good, diverse source of protein and food throughout the day so that you are able to keep those stores replenished. So eating lots of beans, lentils, other legumes, tofu, whole grains, nuts, and seeds to make sure that you have that spectrum. But it is also important to note that soy foods are actually complete sources of protein. So I hear a lot of the time that there's no vegan or vegetarian complete sources of protein, but that's actually not true. Soy foods are, and hemp seeds, chia seeds, quinoa, a few other ones are complete sources of protein. So if you are an athlete, or if that does concern you still getting those complete sources, you can always rely on those foods as well and integrate them into your day.
I love that. And that is, I love hemp. I love the hemp plant. I think it's amazing. And that is one of the reasons why we made our hemp milk for our son as he grew up as a toddler, because of that, the fact that it's a complete protein. And I really think it's pretty cool and kind of geeky to know that we have these pools of certain amino acids. The body is so smart and truly can adapt. And I love that we don't need to worry so much. I do remember in my first nutrition class learning that it was just absolutely essential, if I was going to have rice, that I needed to have beans with it in order to make it a complete protein. And, you know, I couldn't have the beans at dinner and rice and breakfast. Like, I had to have them together. It was very, very ingrained in my brain for so long. Yeah. Okay. So can you explain the different stages of life in which we need more protein, and how can we achieve that through whole plant foods?
Such a good question. So when we're younger, there tends to be, I'm thinking toddlers, babies, young children, there is more of an emphasis on healthy fats. We want to make sure that we're getting enough good quality healthy fats. And that's really important for brain development. So that's really the focal point at those ages. So including lots of nut and seed butters, olive oils, things like omega-3, like flax, chia, and hemp. And as we get older, the emphasis can focus a little bit more on protein. And especially if we are talking about, kids who might be really active, whether they're in a lot of sports or activities, we want to make sure that we're focusing on that protein. So getting that good quality source with most of your meals. And then as we age, as we get older into our 60s and our 70s, we also want to focus on good quality sources of protein just to help to prevent muscle loss as well. But we can get sources of protein from so many different foods, as you had already kind of mentioned. And I tend to say that a lot too. Like if you are getting good, if you're eating enough food, and if you are eating a good diversity of foods and including those high quality protein sources throughout your day, like those beans, lentils, legumes, tofu, tempeh, edamame, then protein likely won't be an issue for you. But it is still important to make sure that you are getting those good quality sources. And especially if you are someone who is very active, your needs will increase a little bit more. So it's important to make sure that you're focusing on that a little bit more than the average person. But that doesn't mean to not care about things like carbohydrates or fat either, because those are also really important.
Good.
Hey friend, before we get too far into this episode, I want to be sure you know about how the environment plays a role on your overall health. For over a decade, I've been learning so much about the lack of health regulation in the personal care and food industries, and that's actually one of the reasons why I started this show. You deserve to know how to protect you and your family from unwanted body burden, and I share further information about how to make better choices and vote with your dollar in our private Facebook community called the Urban Farmacy. On that note, I want to let you know about one of the easiest ways that we've switched to safer, and that's through my favorite clean beauty brand called Beautycounter. Your skin is your largest organ, and what you put on it every day matters a lot. And with a low carbon footprint, cruelty-free formulations, and high-performing results, I haven't found a better beauty brand than Beautycounter in over 5 years of working with this mission-driven brand. To learn more and shop clean, head to mybetterbeauty.com.
Okay, so yeah, we're going to get a little bit into the really active, like I'm going to be asking you about that, kind of the definition of that coming up. But while we're talking about kids, are children and teens who are eating all plant foods going to have strong enough bones for sports and growing up properly? I get this question all the time.
And it's such a good question. And I totally understand why people are concerned. There are a lot of conflicting studies about this, but the reality is when we look at kids who are getting enough calcium, getting enough vitamin D, doing weight-bearing physical activity, there is no increased risk of bone fracture in those, whether they follow a vegan or a vegetarian diet or not. So the main thing to really be focusing on here is to make sure that your kids or that you are getting those nutrients. It doesn't matter if it's from a plant source or whether it's from an animal source. We just want to make sure that we are getting those nutrients. So things that are high in calcium are things like dark leafy greens, almonds, almond butters, soy foods, and plant-based milk. So fortified plant-based milks that you can get from the grocery store, those have a really good source of calcium in them. 1 cup usually has about 30% of your daily need of calcium. So that's a really great option if you want to include those into your diet. But we also know that there are so many other things that impact our bone health that aren't just calcium. So I touched on vitamin D, making sure that you are getting a good source of vitamin D, which usually comes from supplements, depending on where you live in the world. I live in Canada. We get like no sunlight throughout the year. So making sure that you're supplementing is really, really important. And then there's other nutrients like magnesium that impacts our bone health and doing that weight-bearing physical activity as well. So if you are aware of those, if you're working with a dietitian to make sure that you're getting those nutrients in or that your kids are getting the nutrients in, there shouldn't be too much of a concern.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So We are talking about active kids. We're talking about active teens. Let's talk a little bit about sports. So what are some good snacks to give your kids on the go?
Such a good question. So when we're focusing on pre-workout or pre-sport nutrition, we want to be focusing more heavily on carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are what give us that energy. And if we're doing an activity within the half hour or within the hour, typically we want to try and keep those snacks lower in fiber, lower in protein, and lower in fat, just because those can slow digestion a little bit, which usually is a great thing. But if you are trying to do an activity or a workout in a half hour or an hour, you don't want to be experiencing cramping or bloating or anything like that. So things that can be really good are toast with a little bit of peanut butter, just to make it a little bit more satiating. Fruit is always a really good one, like banana, something like that. Even a little bit of fruit juice, if your kid is really active and needs that like quick burst of energy, that can be a really good one to focus on. If your activity is a little bit further away, so if you're, if your kid's going to a practice in an hour or two, you can have something a little bit heavier, like maybe some oatmeal with some chia seeds and plant-based milk to make it a little bit more satisfying, just something that's a little bit heavier. If you are having a snack for your kids that's after a workout, we want to be focusing on that protein for muscle recovery and carbohydrates as well. So maybe that looks like a tofu scramble on toast, or it could be a chia seed pudding. It could be oatmeal cooked with a high protein plant-based milk. It could be a smoothie. You could, if you're having a meal right after, you can always have that as well. And even energy balls, those are really great for on the go. That can be a really good quick post-workout snack as well.
Got it. So carbohydrates before, carbohydrates and protein after. All right, We've got that. So now I see a lot of parents giving their children Gatorade. So do you have suggestions for perhaps a healthier alternative?
Such a good question. So Gatorade, it has its place. If you are someone who's extremely active, then you might need that really quick boost of sugar and electrolytes during or after your workout. But for most of us and for most of our kids, it's probably not necessary. Focusing on something during a workout that is hydrating. So really just water, unless your activity is longer than 1 hour, can be completely sufficient. So water is great for that. If you do need a little bit of an electrolyte boost, so if you need a little bit of that salt to replenish your sweating, you could have something like some fruit, so maybe some orange slices and some pretzels. So that's a good source of carbohydrates with a little bit of salt as well. I've even seen people make their own kind of Gatorade drink. So maybe just some water, a little bit of maple syrup, a little bit of lemon, and then a pinch of salt, just to kind of replenish your sugar and your salt stores. But in general, the takeaway is if your activity is less than an hour, you likely don't need anything other than water to kind of replenish yourself during that activity.
Great. Okay. Yeah. And I always suggest coconut water because it has that natural sodium in there,
Yes.
and the sugar. So
That's a great one.
I love coconut water. I just think that Gatorade is a little bit overused. So, but we're marketed to, parents are marketed to that their children absolutely need that replenishment.
Yes.
And it's just hard to know.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, and I learned in exercise physiology way back in the day that elite and like Olympic athletes they have specific protein requirements that they need compared to the average person. Do you have like a guideline? At what point is it appropriate to say that you need extra protein when you're working out? And the reason why I'm asking this is because people ask me, okay, I started doing my bar workouts, or I started doing yoga or Pilates or light walking, for instance. And now they think all of a sudden that they need all of this extra protein. Can you explain at what level of activity, whether it's for an adult or for a child, that people really need to start thinking about that?
Yes, this is a bit of a trickier question, and you kind of hit the nail right on the head. Everyone is individual, and you're right. There are some activities that do warrant more protein and more of carbohydrates, more of the other nutrients as well, and some that probably don't. So this is tricky because it's also individual. It depends on your other activity level. So whether you're taking a bar class and walking during the day, maybe your protein needs will be a little bit higher than someone that's just walking. So what I would say is if you are engaging in relatively high intensity physical activity, so high intensity would be huffing and puffing, having it, finding it hard to carry a conversation, breathing heavily, about 4 to 5 times per week, you probably do need to increase your protein intake. If you are engaging in a walk for 45 minutes per day, that's an amazing form of exercise. Kudos to you. Walking is amazing. I love going for walks, but you probably don't need to increase your protein as much because you likely aren't engaging the muscles to the same intensity that you would need to. So protein requirements are all kind of based on your needs for muscle repair. And that is the type of activity that, while it's amazing for your cardiovascular system, probably doesn't need as much of that muscle repair as something like I was mentioning, 4 to 5 times per week, engaging in higher intensity physical activity. So that would be my recommendation. Of course, it will be individual person to person, but that's a good kind of guideline to go off of.
Good. So speaking of guideline, can you tell our listeners how to find how much protein they need every day?
Yeah, such a good question. So the recommendations are about 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram. I'm in Canada, so we use kilogram of your own body weight of protein. So that's a good general recommendation to start off of. To be honest, most people are probably getting more than that. So it's probably going to be pretty easy for you to hit those protein requirements, especially if you are eating enough for your body type and including those high quality protein sources like we talked about. Once we start moving into those higher intensity physical activities, our protein needs can range anywhere from about 1.2 to 1.9 grams per kilogram of our body weight of protein per day. So again, those higher intensity physical activities, things like running, things like weightlifting, high intensity interval training, spin classes, all that good stuff, about, those 4 to 5 times per week. And I know 1.2 to 1.9 is a huge range. It is a little bit individual depending on what will work for each person. And you can kind of scale your needs based on that intensity. So maybe you're running 3 times per week, doing some hill workouts in there. You'll probably want to stick closer to the 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. But if you're someone who's doing a lot of weightlifting, maybe training most of the days to failure for your muscles, you probably want to be on that higher end of protein intake, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been talking a lot about protein, which is just like honing in on, the macronutrients. But do we need to be worrying about this on a daily basis? Yes, for like children who might be super active, right? Or like if you are pregnant or a growing toddler, right? We do need to be a little bit more concerned, but like for the average person, do we need to be concerned about our macronutrients?
Such a good question. And generally, I would say no. So I'm a huge proponent of intuitive eating. So listening to your body, listening to what it's telling you. And everyone is going to be a little bit different. There are going to be some people who feel better when they eat a higher protein diet. There are going to be other people who feel better when they eat a higher carbohydrate diet. And that's great. It's all about finding what works best for you. In general, I find most people tend to do well sticking to what I like to call a balanced plate method. So that's aiming for about half of your plate, maybe a third of your plate being vegetables or fruit, about a quarter of your plate being a concentrated protein source, and then about a quarter of your plate being a whole grain or starchy vegetable. And I find that's a good kind of picture view of what a meal should look like or could look like to help you to meet your needs without having to count macros or be too obsessive over it. And with all that being said, this is a trend that I tend to look for within a day or even a week. There are going to be meals that are going to be higher in one of those components than others, and that's totally fine. It's all about kind of balancing out, but that can be an easier way to kind of think about things than to really count those macronutrients. I should say that fat should be added in there as well. So things like nuts and seeds, nut and seed butters, to incorporate that as well. But in general, most people, if you kind of tune into what your body is looking for and then maybe loosely follow that balanced plate method, then you should be okay.
I love that. And that goes pretty a lot in alignment with what I teach with Food for Life through the Physicians Committee from Neil Barnard. He has and coined the power plate, which is basically just you split your plate in half and then half again, and a quarter of it's fruit, a quarter of it's veggies, a quarter of it's grains, and a quarter of it is legumes. And then we have the Dr. Furman saying, we need to add some nuts and seeds in there to make it even more. So I love that. It's super approachable, and that we don't have to stress too much if that doesn't happen at each meal, because our body is quite smart at figuring out exactly what we need. And we have those pools of amino acids in our body to fix if we are higher on one day than the other. Okay, just a few more questions, Lauren. As people are transitioning to a whole food plant-based lifestyle, if that is their goal, what are some essential, maybe supplements or things that we should focus on for sure that we have every day?
Such a good question. So vitamin B12 is one that everyone, if you are following even an 80% plant-based diet, should be supplementing with. You can rely on it sometimes in fortified foods, but I always say that the amount of food that we eat on a daily basis changes so much, and the types of food that we eat on a daily basis can change, that I really do recommend relying on that vitamin B12 supplement. If you are someone who is like me in Canada, where you don't get as much sunlight, getting a vitamin D supplement can be really important as well. I also recommend focusing on omega-3s. So your anti-inflammatory healthy fats. You can get omega-3s from chia seeds, ground flax seeds, hemp seeds, and walnuts. Or some people like to take a supplement as well, just to make sure that they are getting their needs. And then I always recommend trying to focus on calcium. We already talked a little bit about calcium, but that can be a nutrient that can be a little bit trickier to get on a vegetarian or a vegan diet. So trying to incorporate things like dark leafy greens, almond butters, soy foods, and fortified plant-based milks can be really helpful for getting that calcium intake up. And then lastly, iron. So iron is one that isn't necessarily tricky to get on a plant-based diet, but I don't know if everyone really thinks about it as much. So just making sure that you're including things like lentils and black beans, again, tofu, tempeh, edamame, dark leafy greens, and then, like I mentioned, pairing it with that vitamin C source just to boost that absorption as well.
Love it. Awesome. That's the high level overview.
Yeah.
And okay, so Lauren, where can we find you?
So you can find me on Instagram. My Instagram is at tastingtothrive_RD. You can also find me at that same handle on TikTok. I'm trying out TikTok. You can find me on my website, tastingtothrive.com, and on YouTube, Tasting to Thrive.
Awesome. Okay. And this is the question that I ask all of my guests. And it's the very last question, because this podcast is all about living a holistic life. It's not just the food, although we talk about food a lot. What does living a holistic life mean to you?
Oh, such a good question. That's hard. I think living a holistic life means finding balance. And I know that balance is a word that's thrown around so much these days, and some people resonate with it and some people don't. To me, living a holistic life means having fun with the work that you're doing, getting to spend time with family and friends, feeling energized, getting enough sleep, and just feeling content inward, if that makes sense.
I love it. Oh, so good. Thank you, friend, for being on. And I cannot wait for everyone to hear your wise advice.
Oh, thank you so much, Stacey. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Be well.
I'm over here cheering you on because you just finished another episode of The Herban Farmacy. For today's show notes, head on over to theherbanpharmacy.com and be sure to join us inside our private Facebook group called The Herban Farmacy, where we share inspiration, live trainings, and holistic living tips to help you build community and the healthy lifestyle that you've always wanted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit that subscribe button and please consider leaving us a 5-star review. Before we connect again on the next show, follow me on Instagram at The Herban Farmacy. That's Herban with an H and Pharmacy with an F. And I can't wait to hear your wellness journey as we get to know each other better. You know, there's truly no better time than now to level up your life, and I am so proud of you for showing up today. Until next time, be well, Health Crusader.